Wyoming Territory, June of 1879. The wind dragged its fingers through the sagebrush, and Elira Ashford crawled through it with blood on her dress and her baby boy pressed tight against her chest. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her lips were cracked, her arms stung from the thorns, and her breath came in shallow, terrified bursts. Behind her, smoke curled into the sky from the wreckage of the wagon. Her husband was dead, shot through the chest. She had seen it happen. Bandits, 3 of them. They rode down from the hills like wolves on a lamb, and by the time she grabbed the rifle, it was too late. Elira had run with her baby, just grabbed Jeremiah from the back of the wagon and ran into the brush. She had not looked back. Now her dress was torn and her knees bled, but she would not stop. Jeremiah whimpered, his little fingers clutching her collar. He was only 3 months old. All she could think was, keep him quiet, keep moving, do not die. She crawled over a ridge and collapsed just beyond it. The world narrowed to the sound of her child breathing and the ache in her ribs. Then came a voice from behind. "Ma'am," she flinched, pulled Jeremiah closer, her heart hammered against her ribs. "I ain't gonna hurt you," the voice said again, a man's voice, low, steady, careful. "I'm not one of them." She turned her head slowly. A man sat a few feet back, his hands away from his belt, not reaching for the revolver at his hip. He looked rough, dusty boots, shirt faded from years under the sun, but his expression was calm. His eyes were the color of dry grass in autumn. He had a wide jaw, dark hair that curled beneath his hat, and a scar just beneath his right cheekbone. "My name's Zeke Whitlow," he said. "I saw the smoke, I came up the ridge and—" He looked past her at the edge of the hill. "You the only one left," Elira swallowed hard. My husband's dead." "They shot him." Her voice cracked. Zeke nodded once. "I'm sorry." Jeremiah let out a soft cry. Elira rocked him gently, her hand trembling. Zeke shifted forward, still slow. "You need water and shade. There's a dry creek a mile west, Cottonwoods. I can help you get there." "I do not know you," Elira said, her voice raw. "No," he agreed. "You do not, but you need help. And I ain't gonna leave a woman and her child bleeding in the dirt." She looked down at her son. His cheeks were red with heat. He would not survive another hour out here. She closed her eyes and nodded. Zeke moved to her side and carefully reached a hand down. "Let me carry him. I got a canteen. You need both hands to walk." "No," she said, clutching Jeremiah tighter. Zeke did not push. He just stood there with his hand out, waiting. Finally, she let him help her to her feet. When she staggered, he caught her elbow. They walked slowly, Zeke matching her pace. He pointed out a path through the rocks where the brush thinned. The sun beat down on them and Elira's vision blurred, but Zeke kept her steady. They reached the cottonwoods an hour later. Zeke pulled a blanket from his saddle and spread it beneath the trees. He handed her a canteen. She drank, then drank again. Jeremiah fussed in her arms. Zeke crouched low and pulled out a tin of goat's milk from his saddlebag. "I keep it for orphan calves," he said, "but the little one might take to it." Elira hesitated, then nodded. Zeke poured some into a makeshift cloth and handed it to her. Jeremiah sucked at it greedily. They sat in silence. The wind moved through the trees. Elira closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Zeke looked at her, then at the baby. "You got a name?" "Elira Ashford. You from around here?" "No, we were headed to Oregon, had land waiting for us." Zeke nodded again. "I was born out near Wheatland. Been riding fence and moving horses most of my life." They sat quiet for a while. Elira dozed. When she woke, the sky had turned gold with evening. Zeke was still there, sitting with his back against a tree, cleaning his revolver. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He looked up. "Because someone should." She studied him. The way he moved slow, the way he never looked at her too long, there was something careful about him, like he had seen things that taught him not to push too hard. "I do not have anyone else," she said, "just Jeremiah." "You do now," Zeke replied. She stared at him. "I got land," he added. "South of here, lonely piece of prairie, but it is safe. You and the boy, you could come with me. Just until you figure out what comes next." Elira felt the tears sting her eyes. She had not cried since the wagon. Not since her husband fell bleeding into the dust. But now, in the quiet, with Jeremiah asleep and this stranger offering shelter, the grief broke through. Zeke did not say anything. He just let her cry. Later, after the fire was built and Jeremiah wrapped in a blanket between them, Elira looked at Zeke across the flames. "You said your name is Zeke." "Yes, ma'am," she smiled barely. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not found us." He met her eyes. "I think I was supposed to." The words settled soft between them. That night she slept with Jeremiah in her arms and Zeke keeping watch. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the stars burned above them. Elira did not know what came next. But for the first time in days, she felt something that almost felt like hope. And Zeke sat beside that fire and knew he would give up everything he had to keep her and that baby safe. Everything. The trail south bent along a dry wash scattered with bone-colored stones. Elira walked beside Zeke's gelding, one hand on the saddle for balance, the other cradling Jeremiah against her chest. The baby slept, his breath warm through the fabric of her bodice. A hawk circled high above, its shadow sliding over the earth like a memory. Zeke didn't speak unless needed. He rode slow, letting the horse set a gentle pace, reins loose in his hand. The rifle tied to his bedroll shifted with each step of the horse, the stock worn smooth. They hadn't seen another rider in 2 days. Each night they camped by water once an abandoned homestead, then a bend in the river where the cottonwoods grew thick enough for cover. Elira listened to the wind as she fed Jeremiah, her ears tuned to hoofbeats that never came. On the third morning, Zeke stopped at a patch of scrub where the ground changed from gravel to richer soil. He dismounted and handed Elira a strip of jerky and a half-ripe peach from his saddlebag. She leaned against a rock and tore into the meat, her hands trembling from hunger. Zeke crouched nearby, cleaning grit from his boot with a stick. "You always ride alone?" she asked, not looking up, most times. "Why?" he shrugged. "Used to ride with my brother. He married a girl from Laramie, took to cattle. I kept on." She traced the edge of the peach pit with her thumb. "You ever think about settling?" "I did once. Thought I might build a place near Sweetwater. Then the war came through and changed everything." Elira turned her face toward the sun. "You fought?" "No, my father did. Never came back. The land passed to me, but I couldn't hold it. Too young." Too many hands grabbing. She watched a grasshopper leap from stone to stone. "I was 15 when Sherman's men passed through Georgia. They didn't leave much behind." Zeke said nothing, only looked at the horizon where the land rose in soft folds. A low wail stirred from the bundle in her arms. Elira rocked Jeremiah gently, whispering nonsense into his ear. Zeke glanced over but didn't speak. That afternoon, they reached a split in the terrain where the prairie broke into low hills. Zeke pointed toward a ridge with a stand of juniper. "Half a day past that line is my place," he said. "We push steady, we'll get there by dusk." She nodded and adjusted the baby. Her legs ached, but she didn't complain. As the sun dipped low, Zeke led them over the rise. Below stretched a shallow valley, green with late spring grass. A small house sat near the tree line, rough-hewn logs, shingled roof, smoke trailing from the chimney. A corral stood to one side, empty but mended. Behind it, 2 rows of beans poked through turned soil. Elira stared at the cabin, her throat tightening. "You built that?" "Every board." His voice was quiet. "Didn't have much else to do." They reached the gate as the last light faded. Zeke slid from his saddle, opened the latch, and held it for her. Inside, the house smelled of dry timber and wood ash. A cot stood near the hearth, a table with one chair beside it. Everything was plain but clean. She saw a horseshoe nailed above the door and a scrap of woven blanket covering the window. Zeke brought in her things, set them near the cot. Then he motioned toward the chair. "You rest. I'll fix something hot." She sat, Jeremiah curled against her shoulder. He stirred a fire, added water to a tin of beans, and stirred in a pinch of salt from a paper twist. When it bubbled, he ladled it into 2 chipped bowls and handed her one. She took a bite. The heat made her eyes water. "It's good," he chuckled softly. "Don't lie." She smiled, the first real one in days. After they ate, Zeke stepped outside to tend the horse. Elira laid the baby on the cot and wrapped him in the quilt Zeke had left folded at the foot. She sat beside him, brushing his small head with her fingertips. Zeke came back in as the stars rose. He looked at her, then the baby. "You'll both be safe here." "I know." Her voice was steady now. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I ain't good with words, Elira. But you're welcome to stay as long as you need." She met his gaze. "And if I don't want to leave," he didn't answer right away. Then he stepped forward, slow and sure, and knelt beside her. "I'd be grateful." She reached out, her hand resting on his. His skin was warm, calloused. They sat like that, quiet, the fire casting soft light on the walls. Outside, the wind shifted across the valley, carrying the scent of pine. For the first time, she felt the ache of morning ease, the edge of fear dull. And Zeke, watching her with that steady gaze, knew he had not built this house for nothing. By the fifth morning, the silence between them had changed its shape. It wasn't the hush of strangers anymore. It was something steadier, unspoken, but mutual. Elira stood on the porch with Jeremiah bundled in her shawl, watching Zeke hammer a rail back in place at the far end of the corral. The early light caught in his hair, and she noticed how he paused now and then to glance over, like he still wasn't used to someone watching him work. She shifted Jeremiah to her other shoulder. "You always fix fences this early?" Zeke looked up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Best time of day for it, before the sun gets mean." She stepped down into the yard, careful over the ruts. "You mind if I help?" He hesitated, then nodded toward the post pile. "If you can hold one steady, I'll drive it." She set Jeremiah in a crate lined with cotton batting near the porch, then walked over and took hold of a split cedar post. It was heavier than she expected, but she planted her boots and braced it upright. Zeke placed the pointed end in the earth, then swung his maul with practiced ease. The thunk of it echoed through the hills. "You ever raise stock?" he asked between blows. "No," she said, keeping her voice even. "I was raised in a weaver's house. My husband knew horses, but I mostly kept to the loom and garden." Zeke paused and leaned on the handle. "You miss it," she thought for a moment. "I miss the rhythm of it, knowing what came next." "I never thought I'd miss something so small." He nodded once and drove in the next post. By midday, the fence was whole again. Zeke set down his tools and they sat in the shade of the barn, passing a flask of spring water between them. Jeremiah napped nearby, his tiny fingers curled around the hem of his mother's sleeve. "You plan to stay on here?" she asked. "I might," he said. "I thought about selling once or twice. But every time I packed a saddlebag, I'd hear the wind shift and change my mind." She leaned back against the barn siding. "I used to think the only kind of life worth living was one with a plan, but now, I don't know. Maybe doing the next right thing is enough." Zeke traced a line in the dirt with his boot. "You're braver than you think, Elira." She looked over at him. "No, I'm just still breathing. That counts for more than most folks give it credit." That night, a summer storm pushed across the valley. It wasn't sharp with lightning, only a long, low rumble and a curtain of rain that softened the dust. Zeke stood near the hearth, shirt damp from checking the roofline, while Elira rocked Jeremiah in the chair by the window. He watched her, quiet, his hands loose at his sides. "You ever think you'd raise a child?" she asked, not looking up. "No," he said. "Didn't figure it was in the cards." She brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Neither did I, but he's here. And I think he deserves more than a few broken plans." Zeke crossed the room and crouched beside the chair. "He'll have more. I'll see to it, long as you'll let me." She turned to him then, truly turned, and placed a hand over his. "I believe you." They didn't kiss, not yet. But the space between them held something sure, a promise neither had spoken aloud. Later, after Jeremiah was laid down and the fire banked low, Elira stepped outside. The rain had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Zeke joined her and they stood side by side, looking out over the glistening grass. "I don't know what to call this," she said. "You don't have to name it yet," he said. "Just feel it." She slipped her hand into his fingers curled around hers without hesitation. And for the first time since crawling through that sagebrush, Elira didn't feel like she was running. Not anymore. By late June, the high grass around the cabin had turned thick and green, brushing at Zeke's knees as he led the mule along the edge of the southern slope. Elira walked beside him, a basket looped over her arm, her eyes trained on the ground for yarrow and wild onion. Jeremiah rode in a sling across her chest, quiet except for the soft hum she'd taken to singing when the wind rose. Zeke glanced over. "You always know what's worth gathering." "I watched my aunt go into the woods with nothing but a knife and come out with a meal, a cure, and enough color to dye a quilt," she said. "You learn fast when it's that or go without." He adjusted the rope along the mule's halter. "You don't talk much about your people." She shifted a stone with the toe of her boot. "There's not many left to talk about. The ones who made it through didn't all stay close." They moved past a fallen tree, its bark split by lightning seasons back. A pair of squirrels darted through the branches, arguing in high-pitched bursts. Zeke stopped near a patch of tall stems. "That looks like something." "Goldenrod," she said. "If you dry it right, it'll help with swelling." "Good for bruising." He knelt to cut a bundle while she unwrapped a cloth from her basket and laid the stems carefully inside. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose. "You think about planting anything of your own?" he asked. "I have." "There's still time before the frost." She looked toward the cabin, barely visible through the trees. "I'd like to start with herbs, maybe flax, something useful," Zeke nodded. "I cleared a patch behind the barn last spring, never put seed in it." She met his eye. "Maybe now's the time." They worked side by side until the sun climbed high. By then, the basket held roots, greens, and a strip of bark Elira said smelled like camphor when boiled. Zeke watched the way she moved, how she never wasted emotion, how she whispered to Jeremiah without breaking her rhythm. Back at the cabin, she laid the plants out on a flat board near the window, sorting them by leaf and stem. Zeke poured water from the barrel into a basin and set it on the table. "You ever think you'd stay on one piece of land this long?" she asked. He shook his head. "I thought I was made for the saddle. Turns out I just didn't know what stillness felt like." She wrung out a cloth and wiped her hands. "Stillness isn't the same as being stuck." "No," he said. "It's not." Jeremiah stirred in the cot and let out a small cry. Elira moved to him, lifting him gently. Zeke stepped aside, watching how her face softened as she rocked him close. "You know," he said, voice low, "I keep thinking about what it'd mean if you stayed for good." Elira didn't look up. "And what do you think it'd mean?" "That I'd build another room off this one, that we'd raise him together, that we'd plant that flax and everything else you've got in your head." She turned to face him. The baby's breath was slow and even against her collarbone. "You're sure?" she asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." She crossed to him, slow, barefoot on the smoothed floorboards. "Then you should know I don't come easy. I still wake to sounds that aren't there. I still reach for someone who's gone." He took her hand, steady and warm. "I've got my own ghosts. But I'd rather face them with you than keep riding past them alone." She searched his face and something in her eased. "I want to stay, Zeke." "Then stay," he said. "Not because you need to, because you want to." Elira leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't rushed, wasn't uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that came after long days and earned trust. When they parted, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, the fire flickered low, and in that quiet space where two lives had once been scattered by loss, something new took root. They didn't speak again for a long time. They didn't need to. By July, the flax had taken root behind the barn, its blue blossoms swaying in the breeze that rolled down from the hills. Elira stood barefoot in the tilled soil, skirt pinned up at the hem, her fingers brushing through the soft petals. Zeke watched her from the fence line, saddle blanket slung over one shoulder. He had just returned from the trading post south of the river crossing, a half-day's ride down a rocky path. "Brought something back," he said, lifting a small wrapped parcel from his satchel. Elira dusted her hands and stepped over the furrows. "What is it?" Zeke passed it to her without ceremony. She unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside was a length of fine combed wool dyed plum. She ran her palm across it, eyes wide. "I thought you might want something for yourself," he said. "Not the boy, not the house, just you." She held it against her chest for a moment, then looked at him. "No one's brought me a gift in years. I reckon that makes it overdue." She stepped forward and kissed his cheek, soft and without hesitation. Inside the cabin, the days had taken on a rhythm that felt both new and quietly sturdy. Mornings began with the kettle on, Zeke tending the animals, Elira feeding Jeremiah as the light crept across the floorboards. By midday, she worked outside, sometimes in the garden, sometimes boiling herbs over a small fire behind the shed. Zeke strung a clothesline between two trees and built a second chair for the porch, carving a swallow into the armrest. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the ridge, he lingered by the doorway, watching her fold linen into the cedar chest near the hearth. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked. She didn't turn. "I never thought I'd be safe enough to consider it." Zeke stepped inside, removing his hat. "I've been meaning to ask, but I didn't want to rush you, not after all you've come through." Elira straightened and faced him fully. "You've given me more than safety, Zeke. You've given me a place to grow again." He crossed the room and took her hands. "Then I want this to be your home, not just a roof, a life." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "Yes. I want that too." They married the next Sunday beneath the cottonwoods, where the creek had started to run again after the late rains. Zeke wore his cleanest shirt, and Elira's dress was sewn from the wool he had given her, the plum fabric catching the light like river stones. A neighbor from 3 miles east, a widow named Agnes who came once a month with eggs and news, stood as their witness. She brought a jar of honey and a smile that lingered all day. Jeremiah gurgled in his sling, held snug against Elira's chest. Zeke touched the boy's head gently and kissed both their foreheads as the wind stirred the leaves above them. By the time the beans ripened and the nights cooled again, the house had changed. Zeke built a cradle by hand, carving tiny stars along the edge. Elira hung her weaving on the wall beside the hearth, a pattern of intertwined branches and sky. She kept a tin of dried goldenrod in the cupboard and taught Zeke how to steep it when his shoulder ached after long days. One morning, she stood in the doorway with Jeremiah on her hip and looked out at the field where Zeke walked the fence line. He turned as if he felt her gaze and raised a hand. She waved back, heart steady. Later, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Jeremiah slept in the cradle beside them, wrapped in the quilt Elira had lined with soft flax fibers. Zeke reached for her hand and laced their fingers together. "I ever tell you what I thought that first night I saw you under those cottonwoods?" "You didn't have to," Elira said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I saw it in the way you stayed." They sat there until the last of the light sank behind the hills, the quiet between them full and warm. Years passed, and the flax fields spread wider. Jeremiah grew tall and steady, with his mother's quiet eyes and Zeke's sure hands. He learned to ride by the age of 6, and by 10 he was helping mend fence posts beside his father. Elira taught him to read by lantern light, her voice soft over the turning pages. She planted herbs and spun thread, her loom set up near the window where the sun fell longest. Zeke built a second barn when the cattle came, and a third room when Jeremiah asked for space of his own. They never left the valley. Didn't need to. Folks came by, sometimes drifters, traders, neighbors who'd heard about the woman with healing hands and the man who never turned anyone away hungry. And every year when the cottonwoods turned gold, they returned to the same bend in the creek, said little, and stood hand in hand. Their love didn't blaze. It endured. It deepened like a well dug, slow and true. They lived that way all their days, quiet, rooted and whole.